Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well, as always. I mean, as I always hope. I don't know if you're always doing well. Okay, so we're looking at Plato's Meno today, right? One of his dialogues, another one of his dialogues. This will be a bit of a departure. The dialogues are starting to change. So far, we've read early dialogues. We could definitely call them Socratic dialogues. The Meno, though, is, well, some people consider it a late early dialogue. They think of it as near the end of the early period. Some people say it's near the beginning of the middle set of dialogues. Some people just say it's a transitional dialogue. We don't have to put it in either of these categories. We don't have to create a false dichotomy here. It's just its own thing. Okay, so yeah, things are looking a little different. How so? Two main things that stand out, it seems to me, are Socrates makes more claims to knowledge, it seems, or shows more confidence about certain things. He's hesitant to use the word knowledge, but he's endorsing more beliefs, let's say. You'll see what I mean as we proceed. He's less agnostic is another way we could put it, right? The sort of stereotype of Socrates is that he doesn't know anything worthwhile, right? And you're starting to get the impression in the Meno that he may know some worthwhile things. And then that's related to a second point. You're getting some theory here that could tell us how to get more knowledge, right? Epistemology is what we call the branch of philosophy that deals with the study of knowledge. So I would say there's some epistemology here that we didn't see in the Apology or the Euthyphro. The theory of recollection specifically is it's supposed to be a way to gain knowledge when you're starting out not really knowing anything or being certain of anything, which of course is where Socrates likes to start. So recollection is a theory about knowledge and how to get knowledge, and it's well suited to the Socratic starting place. So it looks like Plato developed the theory of recollection as a way of moving forward, starting from being a student of Socrates, right? As a student of Socrates, he would have had to say, oh, I don't know anything worthwhile either. But Plato wasn't content to stay there, or, this is speculative, but that's how it looks. Plato wasn't content to stay there, so he started coming up with theories according to which we can actually gain knowledge if we proceed in the right way. Okay. Meno. Who is this guy, Meno? Well, he's a young aristocrat. He's a bit cocky, which is not at all surprising. That's a normal thing for one of Socrates' interlocutors, right? If Socrates is going to spend a long time talking to someone and trying to get information out of them, that person is almost certainly going to be cocky, right? And so Meno meets that criterion for sure. We know he's aristocratic because he has slaves, because his family has this special relationship with Anytus's family, according to which they sort of exchange guests. and Anytus's family is well off, and they probably share some biological relations, and that's why they have this relationship. And the relationship is called Xenia, by the way. Xenia is how that's spelled. It involves different families in different city-states living with each other periodically, right? Just, it's, again, an exchange of hospitality. So in this case, Meno has come to Athens and he's staying with Anytus. And then presumably at other times, Anytus or somebody in Anytus's family goes to Thessaly and stays with Meno's family. All right, so young aristocrat, kind of cocky. He's an adolescent, late teens. We're not really sure. It's part of the story, though, right? He clearly had attached himself to Gorgias in Thessaly. So he's seeking out a teacher, right? He's young. He wants some guidance, and so maybe he's sought out Socrates, right? The dialogue starts abruptly, which is interesting. It starts with Meno's question to Socrates. Perhaps Meno has sought him out and, is just looking for another teacher, a different kind of guidance, Part of why we don't know if Meno sought Socrates out is that we don't know where this is set. Plato doesn't make it clear. This could be in a public space. This could be in the Agora. Right? So maybe Meno and Anytus both have gone to downtown Athens, and they're talking to people, they're shopping, they're doing whatever. That's where public life really happens, in the Agora. And so maybe that's what happened, and Meno was actually looking for Socrates. But it's just as plausible that Socrates has gone over to Anytus's place, and maybe it's because Anytus has a visitor from out of town, and so Socrates is just saying hi. He likes to start up conversations with people, especially visitors, I would think, right? Someone who hasn't gotten to talk to him before, hasn't had that privilege of being contradicted or whatever. So that's interesting that Plato doesn't want to settle that ambiguity. I'm not sure why. So Meno's an adolescent here, but of course, this all takes place well before Socrates' trial, and then this dialogue is written perhaps at the end of the early dialogue period. So when the dialogue is written and circulated, Meno is a man with a history, and you should know that he's had a political career and a military career, and he doesn't have a great reputation. He's not known for his virtue, right? So then presumably Plato is trying to use Meno, as a sort of case study, and he's trying to comment on the state of ethical education, perhaps, in ancient Greece, right? There's some suggestion, looking at it that way, knowing what we know about Meno, there's some suggestion that Socrates could have helped him, but he was being led astray by others. And of course, Gorgias in particular stands out as a possible candidate who steered Meno wrong. And we'll get more information on that later. Because this is a longer dialogue, I want to say something about the structure, and I'll try to be brief. I think it will help if we keep in mind that there's a definite structure here. So let's say it's a three-part structure. The first part of it is Like the Euthyphro, it ends in Aporia, right? A state of not knowing. So very much in parallel with the Euthyphro, actually. Meno gives 3 accounts of virtue, and they all fail, and then Meno says, I'm puzzled, and he's sort of annoyed with Socrates for making him puzzled. That's the first part of the dialogue. Then Socrates brings up recollection, which I already mentioned. All we'll say about it now is it's a way possibly to get some knowledge when you don't know anything for certain. So that, again, that'll be clear later. So that's why Socrates calls the slave boy over, is to demonstrate recollection, and so that would be a way of getting over the aporia that we had in the first part of the dialogue. And again, that's why this seems to be a transitional piece. We don't end in aporia. We go to the theory of recollection as a possible way to get some knowledge. And then there's this different way of trying to get some knowledge at the end of the dialogue. So this is the third part. Socrates tries to proceed by hypothesis, right, which he seems to have learned from geometry. And of course, it's Plato who was really into geometry. So this isn't coming from Socrates, presumably. It's coming from Plato. So you could say, well, if X, then Y, and that could be your hypothesis, and then you could prove X, and now you've got Y because of the logical connection between them. But also, if X then Y is true, that was deliberately 2 ifs, excuse me. If X then Y is true, then it's also true that if not Y, then not X. Right? If you think about that, you might want to pause and think about that. You'll see that it makes sense. Right? On the assumption of X, Y definitely follows. That's what if X then Y says. So if on the assumption of X, Y definitely follows, then when you know Y isn't true, you know X doesn't obtain. That's called the contrapositive. If X then Y is the original statement, the contrapositive is if not Y, then not X. Anyway, in the third part of the dialogue, Socrates gets some mileage out of making a couple of different hypotheses. Okay? Which we didn't see Socrates doing that in the early dialogues. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. So Meno starts out with his question. As I've already said, this is at 70a. This is just the very beginning of the dialogue. Can you tell me, Socrates, is virtue something acquired by teaching, or is it something acquired not by teaching but by practice, or is it something acquired neither by practice nor by learning, but something human beings possess by nature or in some other way? There's a long history behind this question. It's something that the ancient Greeks talked about a lot. So there's nothing unique or novel about the question itself. Meno must have talked to Gorgias about the same question, but he wants to see what Socrates has to say. So Greeks would often talk about virtue in terms of whether it was by nature or by convention. And so we've got 3 distinctions here, but you could boil it down to those 2, which are just standard. So Meno is saying, is it learning or is it practice? Those are the 2 conventional things, or is it by nature? Or is it something else, right? Now, not surprisingly, it's not surprising how Socrates answers the question right off the bat. He just says, wow, that's pretty heavy. Okay, that's the Dr. Ogle interpretation. Well, he does say something like that. That's a difficult topic, at least, wow. Socrates goes so far as to say, I've never met anyone who knew what virtue was. So then how am I going to say whether virtue is teachable when I don't even know what it is, right? That's basically his first response. Don't know what it is. I can't tell you whether it's teachable. So Meno tries to probe Socrates a little bit about that. Really? You never met anybody who knew what it was? Didn't you meet Gorgias, Socrates? Gorgias comes up pretty early on. Yeah, I met Gorgias. I can't remember what Gorgias said about virtue, right? So that's Socrates being coy. He doesn't think Gorgias knows either, to be clear. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to avoid saying that Gorgias doesn't know what virtue is. He doesn't really need to get into that debate. But he's also trying to draw Meno out, right? Just like we saw in the Euthyphro, Socrates had to do things to get Euthyphro invested in the conversation. Mainly, Socrates had to flatter Euthyphro, as you will recall. Now here, there's a bit of flattery, but it's not as thick as in the Euthyphro. But mainly, Socrates does want Meno to tell him things. He wants Meno to sort of play the expert here. But he's also asking Meno to be a stand-in for Gorgias. So he's also appealing, he's flattering Meno, but he's appealing to his loyalty to Gorgias as well. All right, so he says, yeah, I don't remember what Gorgias said. But you're his student. You've been hanging out with him. Why don't you remind us what he said? And then we'll go from there, right? And so it's kind of slick. It works. And so then we end up with the first account that Meno gives of virtue, right? Again, he needs to say what it is, so then they can talk about whether it's teachable. And Meno says to Socrates at 71e now, I will tell you, Socrates, it is not difficult. Of course, easy peasy. First, then, if you want to know a man's virtue, that is easy. This is a man's virtue, to take part in the city's affairs capably, and by doing so to benefit his friends and harm his enemies, while taking care that he himself does not suffer anything like that. Take care of friends, harm enemies, don't get harmed. Okay? That's for the man, anyway. If you want a woman's virtue, that is not difficult to describe. She must manage the household well, look after its contents, and be obedient to the man. There is a different virtue for a child, one for a male and one for a female. There's one for an older man, one for a free man, if you want to know that, and one for a slave, if you want to know that. There are very, very many other virtues too, Socrates. And if you want to know about them, just ask. So, yeah, pretty cocky, right? And then Socrates, likes to feign surprise and pretend like he's being given a good thing when he's not really sure about that. So he says, "Oh, what a wonderful swarm of answers you've given me." Right? What a wonderful swarm of virtues you describe. Now, that's a problem, right? We already know that from the Euthyphro. We know that that's a problem. You'll remember the 3 different criteria that we came up with in the Euthyphro. these would be criteria for giving a good answer to the question, well, what is it really? And I said then that you can see them come up in other dialogues, right? So here we are. We've got a swarm. What's the problem? Well, of course, we want to know what's in common among virtues. We don't want a swarm, right? Okay, so there's a virtue for a man and a virtue for a woman. So then if I just want to know what virtue is, then you should tell me what's in common among the virtue for the man and the virtue for the woman, right? So that then we know, well, why is that the virtue for the man and why is that the virtue for the woman? Because now we know the common element, right? And we can apply it to the different cases ourselves. So it's not a matter of mere reporting, right? But we actually understand what's going on. If Meno can just say what's in common. And I'll read to you from Socrates now, because the second criterion comes up as well. This is at 72C going into 72D. Socrates says, it is the same with the virtues too. Even if they are many and multifarious, surely they all have one identical form, because of which they are all virtues. And it is right, I would suppose, for the one who is answering to look to that in order to make clear what virtue actually is to the one who asked. Or don't you understand what I mean? And Socrates goes on at length to try to explain this to Meno, but we don't need to get into all that. What I really wanted to point out here is the phrase, because of which they are all virtues. So that's the second criterion that we already saw in the Euthyphro. So we want to know what's in common among the virtues, what they have in common. We want to know their common form. That word is being used here. We want to know what makes virtues virtues. So that's the metaphysical requirement here. We don't seem to quite get the third criterion. Socrates doesn't quite say, give me that model so that I can look at anything and know whether it's a virtue or not. He does say, the one who is answering, the one who is trying to say what virtue is, should look to the form to make clear what virtue actually is to the one who asked. So we're sort of getting there. That kind of sounds like the third criterion, but it's not. Admittedly, it's not that clear. But yeah, this is familiar territory, is the main thing I want to say. Socrates tries to help Meno out a little bit, right, by suggesting things. So hey, Meno, we need to know what's in common. Now you mentioned that a man should take care of the affairs of the city, and a woman should take care of the household, right? So there's some broader issue here about taking care of things and managing things. Maybe that would be a better way to put it, being in charge of things. That starts to lead up into the second account. And then, of course, that would have to be done moderately and justly, right? It's not just a matter of managing things. You could manage things poorly. You could manage things in a selfish way, in an unfair way. So how do you manage things? Well, perhaps moderately and justly. At least, now Socrates isn't suggesting that as a definition. That would have its own problems. But what he is trying to say is, so there is something in common here, right? You can see that. because there's some bit about managing stuff, taking control of things, and then of course that would have to be done in a certain way, moderately and justly, say. So there must be some common account we can give, and that does encourage Meno to give a second account, actually. So we get that at 73D. Okay, so 73D or 73, the end of C going into D, Meno says, well, what else? To fill in the context a little, well, what else is virtue other than to be able to rule people? If you are really inquiring about one thing that covers all of them, yes, indeed, I am inquiring about that. I do want to know what's in common, says Socrates. Okay, so to be able to rule people. Now, it's easy to see some issues already. Right? Socrates is sort of led Meno in this direction, so, maybe he's maybe he's deliberately trying to get him to state something that doesn't work so they can diagnose it and learn something from that. But in any case, clearly, the virtue of a child probably wouldn't be to rule people, and the virtue of a slave wouldn't be to rule people. And I'm just talking internally to the dialogue. Meno and Socrates don't have any criticisms of slavery to offer. Perhaps they should, but just sort of speaking internally, they would have thought that it's part of the slave's role to be obedient and deferent, just as they would have thought it's part of the child's role to be obedient and deferent. So immediately there's a problem, right? It can't just be a matter of ruling people. That doesn't work in all cases. But also, again, the question arises of how we should rule people. You could rule them despotically or tyrannically, so isn't there a way to do it? So shouldn't they be ruled justly and not unjustly? Socrates raises that issue. Right, something like that. It's not just a matter of ruling, but ruling in the right way, in a way that we could call virtuous. Meno agrees, of course. Well, yeah, not just ruling people, but ruling them justly and not unjustly. That must be right, Socrates, because justice is virtue. And that's exactly how Meno says it. It's important to note, because that drives some of the conversation. Meno says yes, they need to rule justly because justice is virtue. He doesn't say justice is a virtue. He just says justice is virtue. So Socrates pounces on that. And by the way, it's not, Socrates does pounce on it, but it's not such an odd thing to say. Some Greeks might have thought justice was a master. Well, some Greeks did think justice was a master virtue, in the sense that it ruled the other virtues somehow, or the other virtues were contained in it. Aristotle says things along these lines. So it's not that weird for Meno to say justice is virtue, but Socrates does take issue with it. Well, wait a minute. Justice is virtue, or justice is a virtue? Which is it? And having brought it up, they do come to agree that, well, justice is a virtue. There is, somewhere else there might be a theory of how all other virtues participate in justice, but there is no such theory here. So Socrates is perfectly justified in saying, well, what about moderation or something like that, right? That's a virtue too, right? So if you rule moderately, that's good too. Justice isn't more a virtue than moderation is. So then we shouldn't say justice is virtue, since moderation is also a virtue. So we don't want to leave the other virtues out. If we don't have a theory that tells us that justice is the master virtue or it incorporates the other virtues, then yeah, that's where we should be right now. We should be saying, well, what we know is justice is a virtue, and moderation is a virtue, and wisdom is a virtue, and courage is a virtue, and so on like that. Okay, so they do agree on that. Meno is starting to get a little hesitant, which tends to happen in these dialogues, right? The interlocutor starts to get a little wary. Socrates wants another account, and Meno doesn't quite know what to say. Socrates tries to change the topic as a way of helping them move forward, right? And he says, basically, look, why don't you practice giving definitions? You're not giving good definitions here. Why don't we try to practice? And, in some other area other than ethics, you can tell me what some things have in common and what makes them the thing that they are. So he picks shape, to get to the point. Why don't you tell me about shape? Why don't you give me a definition of shape? And again, let's avoid just listing different shapes, right? And let's try to say, let's try to give a deep definition, like what really makes something a shape. What are the deep characteristics of it? And now the tables get turned. Meno refuses to do what Socrates is telling him to do. Meno says, "You tell me, Socrates. I want to know what shape is from you." He doesn't quite say it, but Socrates is older, supposed to be wiser. Meno's probably looking for a teacher, so he tries to turn things around. Socrates teases him eventually for being a bit tyrannical. It's probably because he's so good looking, Socrates mentions. But anyway, here's the first thing Socrates says, and I think it's clear he's clowning around when he says this, but here's the way Socrates defines shape at 75b. He says, shape is that alone of existing things which always follows color. Now that's interesting. It's not a boring definition, right? If there is an expanse, is what I was actually trying to say. If there's an expanse of color, right, wherever the color is the same over some expanse, over some bit of extension, wherever the color is the same, that will make a shape. So I think his definition is interesting. Shape is that alone of existing things which always follows color, right? So the color is primary, and where I'm starting to bleed into the second definition here, but I'm going to say it anyway. And where the color sort of ends, where there's a boundary of the color, then you get a shape. And then Meno says that's a foolish definition, and I think that's exactly what Meno is supposed to say. I think that's what Socrates wants him to say. That's a foolish definition because somebody might not know what color is, right? And so I think Socrates is trying to make exactly that point, but he's trying to get it to come out of Meno's mouth. We need to define our terms. We need to define things in terms of what we already know, in terms of what's already familiar, right? And this seems to hark back to the idea that, perhaps virtue is to rule over something or some people, but we had to add justly, right? But we don't know what justice is yet. We're trying to figure out what virtue is. So we certainly don't know the definitions for particular virtues. So we want to go in the right order, right? So it seems like in trying to give the second account, Meno was going in the wrong order. So then Socrates deliberately goes in the wrong order when he gives his first definition of shape. So he gives a different definition of shape after Meno harasses him, right? So 76a, Socrates says, a shape is that which limits a solid. In a word, a shape is the limit of a solid. So that's why I said I was already groping toward or bleeding into the second definition. We need the idea of a limit, it seems, to really get at what shape is. So I like the way Socrates likes it too, of course, and Meno likes it. I like the way Socrates has arrived at the idea of shape here. He defines it in terms of the three-dimensional world in which we live. You take a solid, right? Well, there's a limit, there's a boundary where the solid is meeting what? Something else, maybe the air, whatever it is. That's a shape, right? That makes really great sense. All shapes would have to have that in common, right? Even if you put one on two dimensions, it's the shape of some possible solid that could exist in three-dimensional space. So all shapes have it in common, and it seems like a deep explanation. Well, how would you get a shape? Well, you'd have to have like a thing, like a solid, and it would have to have a boundary, and now you've got a shape. Okay, so Meno likes it, and Meno now wants Socrates to define color, of course. And we don't need to worry about that definition too much, but I will say it, and I'll say one thing about it. So 76d, Socrates says, color is an effluvium from shapes which fits the sight and is perceived. So notice that the definition of color mentions shape, but we already defined shape. So now we're going in the right order, and that's good. And notice that Socrates tried to give the answer in a way that Gorgias would like, because Meno has been working with Gorgias. So again, there's an issue of, look, we've got to define the unfamiliar in terms of what is familiar. So you're familiar with this theory about effluvia, I guess would be the plural. You're familiar with this theory, so let me talk about color in those terms, right? And Socrates doesn't like his definition very much. He says that. He likes the definition he gave of shape. He doesn't like this definition of color, and it seems to be because it uses this obscure technical term, effluvium. That word is part of a whole theory of perception that people like Gorgias were spreading, right? And it's a theory. It's technical. It doesn't talk in basic terms that everybody would understand. So Socrates doesn't like it as much as the other definition he gave. Okay, we're getting near the end of the part of the Meno that resembles the Euthyphro, right? The part where Aporia occurs. So Meno is sort of emboldened now. We're making progress again. We're getting traction. We've got some good definitions under our belt, although they have nothing to do with virtue. So anyway, Meno's got his courage back, and he says at 77b, virtue is to desire beautiful things and have the power to acquire them. To desire beautiful things and have the power to acquire them. And then Socrates tries to clarify. Now, by beautiful things, you mean good things. You don't think those are separate, right? And the Greek language would sort of warrant this kind of slippage between goodness and beauty. And this is just how the Greeks think in general. Even if it weren't for their language, they still might put goodness and beauty together. There is an idea sort of latent in the text that Meno is a good candidate for virtue because of his physical beauty. That seems to be implicit here. Anyway, Socrates wants to clarify. People desire good things, right? That's what you're saying. And Meno says, yes, of course, and having the power to acquire the good things. Now, part of the definition isn't needed, right? Because as Socrates points out, everybody desires good things. So we could drop that part, right? And we could just say, well, it's the power to acquire good things. Some of this we've seen before, so I don't want to belabor it, but we should mention it. Why is it redundant to say, that virtue is the desire for good things? Well, remember the claim in the Apology that people don't willingly harm themselves, rather they try to benefit themselves, right? So this is this is a different variant of the same idea. People want to be happy is really the core idea here. So people want to have good things, they want to avoid bad things. Can they desire bad things? Well, yes. Socrates and Meno agree on that, but as they talk, they also agree that, when people desire bad things, it's because they think those things are good. They don't desire bad things as such. You don't desire bad things under that label bad. You desire bad things that you've mistaken for good things. That's when you desire bad things. So maybe it will sound odd, but you don't desire to desire bad things for sure. You desire to desire good things. So then if you desire bad things, that doesn't fit this other desire that you have. You desire to desire good things, and you only accidentally desired the bad things. Maybe that was a little too technical, but that is part of what's going on here. Everybody desires good things. Everybody wants to be happy. Okay, so then we're just left with the power to acquire good things. And so, the same old issue arises. Wait a minute. How should that power be exercised? You can't just exercise that power any old way at all, right? You would want to exercise your power justly and piously, wouldn't you? And Meno says, well, yes, of course. So he wants to, of course, build that into the definition of virtue. All right. Virtue can't just be the power to acquire good things, but it must be that power used justly and piously, and whatever other virtues get thrown in here. But anyway, as Socrates says, look, you can't define virtue that way. You can't define a virtue by appealing to a part of virtue. You can't say, more generally, you can't say, virtue is whatever employs some part of virtue. Well, we don't know what virtue is, right? So we don't know what piety is, and we don't know what justice is because they're both virtues, and we haven't said what virtue is. Right? So don't define a thing with a part of itself. That's not going to work, and it's a bad order to go in, which isn't totally explicit in the text, but the issue of the correct order has certainly come up. Wouldn't the proper order be to define virtue and then to define justice by saying it's the virtue that, right? And then you define piety by saying it's the virtue that, da da da. Give a more specific characteristic. Courage is the virtue that, da 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 da. Which one, right? That came up in the Euthyphro as well, as you might recall. Piety is a part of justice. Well, which part, right? And then, of course, justice and piety and courage and moderation and wisdom are all parts of virtue, but then the question arises, which part, But of course, we also want to know the more basic question of what virtue actually is. So if we know what virtue is, and then we can say which part justice is and which part piety is and which part courage is. Well, wow, now we have a swarm of definitions, but they're definitions of different things. So the swarm would be good in this case. Okay. So now is when Meno really balks at giving another account. I already mentioned this would happen. He doesn't want to go on. He's upset that Socrates has stung him, right? He compares Socrates to the flat-nosed stingray. That was something famous about Socrates that I probably haven't mentioned yet, that he was considered snub-nosed, had a flat nose. So Meno calls him a stingray. And so, you got a flat nose, which he doesn't quite say explicitly, but that's definitely part of the idea. And you've stung me, and I'm puzzled, and I'm discombobulated, and I don't know what to say, right? And this is when we finally get to the paradox of inquiry that motivates the interrogation of the slave boy. So let's read what Meno says. So Socrates has been insisting that he doesn't know whether virtue is teachable because he doesn't know what it is, right? And then so you could kind of generalize that point. Isn't Socrates saying something like this, like, I don't know what properties virtue has because I don't know what it is, right? And that does create the paradox that Meno formulates. So this is partly Socrates' fault, right? If you don't even know a single property of a thing, how will you know when you've found it? So anyway, so Meno says at 80d, and how are you going to inquire about it, Socrates, when you do not at all know what it is? For what sort of thing from among the ones you do not know will you take as the object of your inquiry? And even if you do happen to bump right into it, how are you going to know that it is the thing that you did not know? And then Socrates generalizes that in a way that we will explain as things unfold. At this point, Meno and Socrates together have formulated the paradox of inquiry, right? Meno has formulated it in a somewhat narrow way. It seems he seems to be asking about virtue, right? And then Socrates generalizes what he says. Meno wants to know, how will you know when you found virtue, you don't know anything about it at all. So how will you know when you have found what you're looking for? And Socrates says, we know this bit, we know this puzzle. Not that he uses the phrase paradox of inquiry, but this is a known tactic of sophistical people. They could sort of grind the argument down by saying these sorts of things. Um, so we'll read Socrates' formulation of it here. This is at 80e. Socrates says, I understand what you want to say, Meno. Do you see how eristical the argument is that you are spinning? Um, that's a word like sophistical, these are people dedicated to making arguments and sounding good and being rhetorical, right? Do you see how eristical the argument is that you are spinning? According to it, so it seems it is not possible for a person to inquire about what he knows or about what he does not know. After all, he wouldn't inquire about what he knows, since he knows it. And there is no need to inquire about something like that, or about what he does not know, since he does not know what he is to inquire about. And Meno says, well, don't you think it is a beautiful argument, Socrates? Well, Socrates thinks it's a lazy sort of argument. But we'll get to the laziness soon enough. But I should emphasize that it's partly Socrates' fault that we've arrived here, right? Because Socrates has been insisting that he can't say anything about whether virtue can be taught when he doesn't know what it is. Right. So its teachability would be a property that it has. And he's saying, I can't know whether virtue has this property when I don't know virtue, when I don't know everything involved in virtue. Right. So that does put Socrates in a bad position because he seems to be saying, right, if he doesn't know whether virtue has this property when he doesn't know the whole of virtue, then I guess he would also say, well, I don't know if it has this property either, right? So his view seems to be he doesn't know what the properties of virtue are when he doesn't know what it is, and that's what puts him in a bad position. How would you then recognize virtue if you found it? If you don't know any of the properties for sure, right? How would you know if you found it? Think of a black cat. How would you know if you found a black cat? Well, it has black fur. Those are really two properties rolled into one. It has a tail, typically. It's got sharp claws. It goes meow. It's got pointy ears. Um, Imagine you're looking for a black cat and you don't know that it's black, which would be odd. And you don't know that it has fur, and you don't know that it has claws and pointy ears, and that it says meow. And well, how would you proceed? Right? How would you have any idea what you're looking for? Well, you wouldn't. Um, so I don't know that it's a beautiful argument per se, but it's somewhat fitting, right? Um, Okay, but it is the kind of argument that ends inquiry. It's the paradox of inquiry, and it seems to show that, well, you can't really carry out inquiry. So then there's nothing left to do. So that's why I referred to the argument as a lazy argument, and that's how Socrates sees it. He wants to dissolve or get rid of the paradox of inquiry so that they can get on with the work. Right. Meno is happy to throw up roadblocks or impediments or whatever. He's having a good time. Socrates wants to know about virtue, right? And the paradox of inquiry is definitely not going to help with that. Okay, so how do we proceed in the face of this paradox? Well, textually speaking, let's say that, Socrates appeals to a religious doctrine, and he specifically appeals to the immortality of the soul, right? Now, there are ways to get what he wants without making the soul immortal, and we can talk about those later. But right now, we're going to go with the text, right? So Socrates has talked to a lot of different kinds of people. Um, some of them believe in an immortal soul. Some of them believe in reincarnation, right? So you could have this view on which um, the soul has been around for an infinite amount of time already. And clearly souls are embodied. If you believe in souls, then you think, oh yeah, I have one and you have one. And so they show up in bodies, but they're immortal. So then you would think, you would sort of infer that they get recycled, that they're going in and out of bodies, right? And Plato suggests that view elsewhere. He's not adamant about it. I don't think he definitely believed in reincarnation, but he's aware of the view, and he can see that it will solve some of the problems that arise from Socrates' own views, right? Okay, so supposing the soul is immortal and goes in and out of bodies, well, then the soul's really been around and has seen a lot, and conceivably, if it's really been around an infinite amount of time already, then I guess it's seen everything there is to see, right? And so it knows the whole universe and everything involved in the universe, right? That would seem to follow from the basic stipulation um, that the soul is immortal, right? Taking that seriously, knowing that souls show up in bodies, it seems like we could infer that souls get recycled, they get reincarnated, and so then over an infinite span of time, the soul has seen it all. Okay, well, if that's true, then I could be in the position in which I don't know what virtue is. I don't know for sure what properties it has. And yet, if someone showed it to me, I could I could say, yeah, I could remember, right? I could have beheld virtue previously, right? In fact, I could have beheld an infinite number of instances of virtue. So that's somewhere in there, somewhere in my soul, and I'm doing this to my brain, but wherever my soul is, somewhere in there, there's this knowledge of virtue, right? I've seen infinite instances of virtue. Maybe somebody's told me the definition before, and then I saw that it was true before. Whatever the reason, I've got infinite experience. So if somebody could just show me virtue, tell me what the definition is, that will trigger recognition, even though I don't currently consciously know what virtue is, and I don't know for sure what properties it has. Okay, so yeah, maybe there's no teaching and no learning, but maybe there's just recollection, um, right? And then, I teach for a living, so suppose recollection is what we have, instead of transmission of knowledge, which is, what we would have thought was going on, then my role as a teacher should be to trigger recollection within you, right? Okay, so how does that work? Of course, Meno is spoiled, and so he demands to know from Socrates how that will work. Give me a demonstration. Show me how this can happen. So that's why Socrates calls over this slave boy that normally attends to Meno. We don't know exactly what he does for Meno, carries his stuff around, probably does whatever Meno tells him, I suppose. Um, so this slave boy, of course, is not educated, hasn't studied geometry, hasn't had a tutor, hasn't gone to school. Um, sometimes Greeks educated their slaves. It wasn't unheard of, but as you can imagine, perhaps the prevailing line of thought was, well, they're just a slave, they're not going anywhere, and I don't mean to endorse that, of course. I'm just trying to tell you what Greek society was like. Um, why, we're not going to invest in them. We're not going to invest in their success. We're not going to invest in their education. So I take it this is a typical slave boy in that respect. Nobody's bothered to teach him anything or get him a tutor or try to send him to lessons or anything like that. Okay, so Socrates calls the slave boy over, or Meno and Socrates together get the slave boy to come over. And Socrates starts making figures in the dirt. Okay, so let's get a figure up here. All right, so here's a figure that we can start with. So first, Socrates just draws A, B, C, D, let's call it. Just, in other words, scan your eyes over the figure going from A to B, B to C, C to D, right? D back to A, the big square, right? So first he draws this big square. Um, and he asks the slave boy about the square. You know what this is. The slave boy knows that this is a square. He's picked that up, right? He knows that the square has four equal sides, so he's at least a competent user of language, of course. Um, now the question is, now what about the area of the square? Do we know how area works? Do we know how to calculate that? So let's stipulate, says Socrates, using his own word. Let's stipulate that each side is 2 feet. Now we know all the sides are equal because we know what a square is. So let's say AD is 2 feet long, and so then all the other sides are 2 feet long. So what's the area of the square? And Socrates and the slave boy agree that, of course, it would have to be 4 square feet, right? 2 times 2 is 4, so there you go. The slave boy can do a little bit of multiplication. Pardon me. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, let's suppose we want some other area, right? What if we want to double the area of the square? What should we do? Okay, well, let's get another figure up here. Okay, here we go. We're going. All right, so we started out with A, B, C, D. Okay, and what if we want to double the size of the square? In other words, what if we want to double the area? Right, and that's the question that Socrates poses to the slave boy. How are we going to double the area of this square? So in other words, we already determined the side is 2 feet long. So the whole thing is 4 square feet in area. How are we going to get a square that is 8 feet in area? How would we do that? Now the slave boy is not educated, doesn't know geometry. So what he says is intuitive and natural and what you would expect someone to say who isn't educated in this area, right? He says, well, let's just double the side, right? Let's double that line that constitutes the side of A, B, C, D here, right? And so we've got A, B, C, D there in the lower left. And if we just repeat AD, right? We take that length and we put it above AD, then we get DL. You see what I'm saying, I hope, right? We take AB and we double it, right? We take that length and we stick it over to the side of AB, and then we get the line AJ, right? So AJ is twice the length of AB. AL is twice the length of AD, right? So here's another square. We've followed the slave boy's recommendation here. So AL must be 4 feet long, and AJ must be 4 feet long. And then of course, just looking at the picture, you immediately see that we've done something wrong. Something has gone wrong, right? Because looking at the picture, we see that AB is sorry, what I mean is ABCD, that square, that appears in here 4 times in a way, right? Because by doubling the sides, right, you end up with a whole square of the size of ABCD above ABCD. In other words, DC and L, right, is clearly the same size as ABCD. But also to the right of ABCD, you've got BJMC, and it's clearly the same size as ABCD. And then you've got CMKN, which is clearly the same size as the other 3 squares, right? And so you've ended up with 4 squares that have an area of 4 square feet. And so what have you got? Well, you've got 16 square feet. And then of course you can do the math if you want to do it that way. All right, AL is 4 feet long now by stipulation. LK is 4 feet long by stipulation. So the area has to be 4 times 4, which is 16 square feet. Okay, so remember, we were trying to double the area. ABCD has an area of 4 square feet. We were trying to double the area. So we wanted to get to 8 square feet. But instead we have 16 square feet. So this is too big, right? And importantly, very important for the story, the slave boy can see very well that this is too big, that this is not what he was trying to do. He can see that for himself. He's got Socrates asking him questions, but he can see this isn't what he was trying to do, right? And Socrates points out to Meno, hey, look at this kid go, he knows some things, he knows some of the answers to the questions I'm asking him, and he knows that something has gone wrong and he's become puzzled. And isn't that good? Because he thought he knew what to do to get double the area, and he's able to recognize that he didn't know after all, and that's progress. So now he can try something else because he can see that he was getting it wrong. So Socrates points out And the slave boy is agreeing the whole time that, well, okay, a side of 2 doesn't get us 8 square feet, and a side of 4 doesn't get us 8 square feet. Um, the first gets us 4 square feet, the second gets us 16 square feet. We want something between 4 and 16. So don't we want something between a side of 2 and a side of 4? Well, of course. The slave boy can see that that's true, right? He can see that it's true. Very important to the story. When Socrates points it out, he can sort of check for himself. Oh yeah, yeah, we want a side between 2 and 4. Okay, well, why not try 3 then? Right? Makes sense. It's natural. If you don't know where you're going, this makes sense. It's a natural thing to do, right? Um, so looking at A, B, C, D again, what if we take the length of AE and add it, you know, to that side AD? So we add another AE in some sense to AD, right? And that's how we get 3, right? Or the result will be 3, however you want to put that. And looking at AB, we've got these squares, or sorry, we've got these lines bisecting A, B, C, D. Socrates asks the slave boy about bisection. Can't we bisect the square? Can't we sort of cut the lines in half? So I've got the lines here representing the bisection. And so we can use those to talk about this other square that we're constructing. We've added the length of AE to AD. Let's add the length of AH to AB, right? And that gives us AO. So we've got AQ and AO. And since AD is 2, AE must be 1. So AQ must be 2 plus 1, which is 3. AO must be 3. Right? And again, when you draw it, you can see something's amiss because you've got this rectangle above ABCD, and you know that the area of that must be 2, right? Because it's as if you've taken half of the ABCD square and put that half above the square, right? And so you've got 2 square feet sitting above ABCD, which is 4 square feet, and that's 6. And then similarly, you've got this rectangle of 2 square feet to the right of ABCD for the same reasons, right? Because HG is bisecting the square, and so you've kind of just taken that rectangle BCGH and you've just duplicated that over to the side, and clearly that's half of the original square, right? So that's another 2. So you got ABCD, which is 4. You've got the rectangle above it, which is another 2. You've got the rectangle to the side of it, which is another 2. So that's 8, but this has to be a square. So then you've got that little bit there. In other words, you've got that corner C, and there's another square sitting there. So what you've got is 9 square feet, right? And of course, you could do it by multiplication. AQ has to be 3. AO has to be 3. 3 times 3 is 9. What we've really got here is 9 square feet. We were trying to get 8. So close. So close. Not quite there, right? So the slave boy can see that we haven't succeeded. He's a little frustrated. He's definitely puzzled. Socrates again makes a big deal out of how he's puzzled and that it's good. right? Because he thought he knew how to do this. He thought he knew how to double the area of the square. He's made two bad attempts. He's gotten it wrong. He got closer, though, the second time. And it's good that he knows that this isn't working because he can try something else. And of course, Socrates has to dig into Meno a little bit. So let's read some of this here. So look at 84b. Not very far into B at all. Socrates says to Meno, then isn't he now better off as regards the thing he did not know? And Meno says, I agree with that too. Socrates says, by making him puzzled then and numbing him like a stingray, have we done him any harm? Meno says, no, I don't think so. So Meno was upset about being numbed or puzzled and didn't like what Socrates was doing to him. But now that it's being done to someone else, Meno can see that there's no harm done. And Socrates says now, we have certainly done something useful, it seems. It's not just that we haven't harmed him, we've done something useful as regards finding out how the matter stands. For now he might actually inquire into it with pleasure, since he does not know. Whereas before he thought he could easily speak well in front of lots of people and on lots of occasions about the figure that is twice the size and how it must have a side twice as long. So it seems, says Meno, right? So Meno said, hey, I've given lots of speeches on virtue in front of lots of people and everything went really well. And Socrates is mocking him a little, right? He's also saying, he's not just mocking him, he's saying, well, that kind of sucks for you that it went well. That's not a good thing. So you got up in front of people and you said things about virtue that weren't true, apparently, since you're not able to give an account now and you can't defend what you say, right? So back then you must have given a poor account of virtue and nobody took you to task. So that's kind of sad, right? Nobody took the trouble to try to correct you, and nobody took the trouble to try to get the account of virtue right, apparently. So that's bad. And now we're doing better. We know that we're puzzled. We can keep working through it. All right. So the slave is puzzled, doesn't really know how to proceed. Socrates starts doing something else with his figures. We need a third figure here. Okay, so let's take it. This one's not labeled. Didn't see the need. Um, let's take it that this is AJKL, AJKL. It's the bigger square, right? So in other words, ABCD is there in the lower left corner, right? So this then is the square, the biggest square on the screen here now is the square with the area of 16 square feet. And ABCD is in the lower left corner. So that one square with the one diagonal in it is 4 square feet, right? You got me? Okay. So Socrates draws a diagonal and he asks the slave boy, you know what this does, dude? Can you see that this bisects the square? Yeah, I get it, right? It cuts the square in half. We can all see it, right? Again, which is important to Socrates' case. You might not know what bisection means, and somebody might say diagonal, and you don't know what they mean, but then you draw this, and you say, look at this diagonal here. Look at this line I drew in the middle of the square, cutting it in half. And everybody looks at it and says, yeah, yeah, that cuts it right in half. Okay, good, good. So each diagonal in each of the four squares that make up the bigger square is cut in half, right? So focusing on ABCD, which is in the lower left, remember that had an area of 4 square feet. And we can see the diagonal cuts it in half. So then each triangle that is formed by cutting the square in half, we already know that it has an area of 2 square feet, right? And so you should see where this is going. I mean, you should have read the text anyway, but even if you didn't, you see where this is going. So we've bisected each of the squares. You can see that there's a smaller square inside the biggest square, right? You know that the lower left is 4 square feet. You know that the bigger square is 16 square feet. So if you've bisected each of the 4 squares that's only 4 square feet, and each of them is 2 square feet, each of the resulting triangles is 2 square feet. Well, you look at those triangles in the middle that form the middle square, the smaller one, but not the smallest. I guess it's the one in the middle, right? It's got sort of purplish blue lines, if that helps. That's why I didn't want to say the color. Is it purple or is it blue? It's kind of purplish blue, isn't it? I don't know what other people are seeing. That square, that is made up of 4 of these triangles that have an area of 2 square feet, right? So that's our square that we've been looking for, right? That must be 8 square feet there. That must have an area of 8 square feet. We just had to use the diagonal. Okay, and the slave can see it and knows that it's true. And yet this is rather complicated. This is some version of the Pythagorean theorem. If you think about it, those triangles are right triangles, right? And what we're saying is, the smaller square has an area of 4, which is 2 times 2, right? So any of these triangles has 2 sides that are 2 feet long, and then it has this other side, and we're not so sure how long it is exactly. But if we do enough math, we know that the area is 8, right? So what are we dealing with here? Well, I don't want to overcomplicate matters, but let's just say you do the math and you realize that 2 squared plus 2 squared equals, that bluish purplish line squared, right? In other words, a couple of ABCDs, right, is equal to the area of the middle thing. I mean, that's part of what we just figured out, and that is the Pythagorean theorem, if you can see that. In other words, the purple line square is a square, right? And its area is a sum of 2 squares of the size A, B, C, D. So basically we figured out A squared plus B squared equals C squared in the special case in which we've got a right triangle with 2 equal sides. Sorry if I'm overcomplicating things. It's kind of exciting though if you realize that this is the Pythagorean theorem. I mean, it's exciting anyway, but to sort of lead the slave boy along and show him that the Pythagorean theorem is true, right? That's complicated, but Socrates has done it, it seems. So that's impressive, right? And it does seem to indicate that there's some latent knowledge within us that can be triggered, right? And if there's latent knowledge in us with regard to geometry, then there could be latent knowledge in us with regard to ethics. Okay, we're going to have a break in the video right now. I've got to get the screen back to normal, and we will pause there. Okay, I took a little break. I had to go into Zoom so I could put things up on the screen easily, and now I'm back to using some software that I like better. Not that you needed to know that, but I announced a break, so I thought I'd explain a little bit. I hope you took a break because this video is getting long. Anyway, so now we have some reason to think recollection could work and could actually get us some knowledge, and then that gives us some hope that we could get some knowledge of virtue specifically. Let me say a little bit more about recollection and then move on to this issue about hypotheses, using hypotheses to proceed. So Plato is putting this forward as a religious doctrine. It involves the immortality of the soul. I do want to point out that we can think recollection is a real phenomenon without being committed to the immortality of the soul. I mean, for one thing, we have a well-developed theory of evolution by natural selection, right? So our mental faculties have been adapting to the environment in which we live over the course of millions, hundreds of millions, depending on how far back you want to go. You could say billions of years, but I mean, as far as brains go, let's say hundreds of millions of years. I'm not a biologist, but something like that, right? Maybe not quite a billion. Anyway, since our brains and our minds have been adjusting to the environment for such a long time, it is possible, maybe it's even plausible, that there is information about the world that's implicit in the way that our minds function. And I do believe that's what's going on with geometry specifically, which Plato uses as his example of recollection. We are adjusted to living in a three-dimensional Euclidean space. The theory now is, broad scale, cosmologically speaking, we're not in a Euclidean space, but on the surface of the Earth, it's as if we live in a Euclidean space. So it does seem like, we can get information about the nature of Euclidean space and shapes in Euclidean space by turning to our own mental faculties. That seems to be precisely what the slave boy is actually doing when Socrates keeps asking him questions. Okay, so that's a possibility, but that's not the only possibility. I'll give you a couple examples, and then we'll move on to hypotheses. You might have spent your childhood watching your parents cook, right? Maybe, hypothetically, right? So, okay, probably this didn't happen, but you might have been in the kitchen a lot while they cooked. You might have watched. You might have eventually emulated them, right? And so you use the seasonings the way they do, and you use the same ingredients they do, and you've got the moves down, right? If that were so, there would be knowledge about how flavors work together implicit in your cooking practices, right? And you could reflect on how you cook and get knowledge from reflecting on how you already cook, because what you did was you copied what you saw, right? And there was knowledge there, but it wasn't explicit. So you could pause and reflect and get some explicit knowledge from your own cooking practice because you copied it from elsewhere. There are long traditions of shipbuilding at various places in the world, and when I say long, I mean, millennia, right? So there are people building ships who copied their master, in other words, they were apprenticed to someone, and that person copied his or her master, and this goes back and back and back and back. And so that's just an example that's not cooking. There can be a certain way to put the wood together to make it watertight. There could be a certain kind of wood that you use. There could be a way to cut the fabric for the mast that works really well. And you could have just copied these things and you make these boats. And of course you make refinements because you're a human being and you're intelligent. And so you tweak. But if you were one of these shipbuilders, there would be a lot of knowledge in the shipbuilding that's implicit because somebody else had an insight and changed the way shipbuilding was done. And the insight continues to influence the practice, but you don't personally, as a shipbuilder, have the insight. You would have to regain the insight by reflecting on the shipbuilding practice, right? We could call that recollection. We could call getting knowledge from your cooking practice recollection. More generally, okay, that was two local examples and then a broader example. More generally, language adjusts itself to reality over time. We take more and more refined views on reality, on what the world is like. Our language, there are pressures on language to adjust to the way things are and to the way we are, right? So there certainly could be, and philosophers often have thought that there is important information implicit in the way we use language, in the way we use certain terms, also in grammatical structure. There could be knowledge about the physical world latent in grammatical structure. There could be knowledge about ethics latent in ethical terms themselves and how we define them and how we use them, right? And if we stopped and we reflected on language for a while, we could get knowledge and we could call that recollection, right? And insights have gathered around the language and influenced the way that we speak, and they could be recaptured. So I'm not going to press on this very hard. Mainly I'm trying to tell you that you do not have to think that the soul is immortal to think that recollection is possible. Okay, so there are other routes, I suppose you could say. So with a theory of recollection in place, Socrates and Meno are ready to proceed. Or in other words, we've found our way through the paradox of inquiry. We know we're pretty sure we can get knowledge, because even if we have no idea what we're looking for, recognition could be triggered, right? So in theory, we can go forward, except that Socrates and Meno can't agree on exactly how they want to move forward. Socrates, bless his heart, wants to define virtue. hey, let's give another account, right? Not surprisingly. Let's just figure out what virtue is. Let's say what it is. Then we can move forward. I'm sure Meno's tired of that issue. He wants to go back to his original question of whether virtue is teachable, right? And he's insistent and he's handsome. And so Socrates yields, gives in. And so he's trying to move forward on this question of whether virtue is teachable, but then he doesn't know what it is, so how is he going to proceed? He wants to proceed from the definition, right? Because virtue is this, we know that it's teachable. That's what he wants to do. That's what he can't do because he doesn't have a definition of virtue. So he formulates some hypotheses. This is a technique used in geometry, but we're not going to worry about the connection to geometry. Scholars don't really agree on how to construe what Socrates says about the geometrical hypothesis in the text. So we won't bother with it. We've probably done enough with geometry today. Okay, so let's just say we're going to proceed by hypothesis. The main hypothesis at issue is if virtue is knowledge, then it's teachable. There's probably more to it than that, but that is the essential thing that we need, actually, so I'm going to be a little bit minimal here. If virtue is knowledge, then it's teachable. Whenever you know an if-then statement is true, you also know that its contrapositive is true. What does that mean? Well, suppose we know that if x, then y. Like we really know if x, then y. Well, that means that with x in place, that sort of forces y to be in place. It forces it. You know, if we know, we have knowledge that if x, then y. Well, if x is in place, it will force y to also be in place. If x obtains, y will obtain. So then it also would be true that if not y, then not x. Because if x were the case, then that would force y to be the case. So then if we know that y doesn't obtain, then we also know that x doesn't obtain because it would have forced y if it did. Right? So if x, then y is considered logically equivalent to if not y, then not x. And of course, that is important in the text because on the one hand, they're saying if virtue is knowledge, then it's teachable. But then they turn around and say, but it seems like it's not teachable, so then it's not knowledge, right? And that's just standard logic, to be clear. But that's not the first assumption they work with. The first assumption they work with is virtue is a good thing. And then that's a pretty safe assumption. Why have they been seeking it? What is this inquiry really about? Why are people arguing over virtue and how to get it and how to make the young people virtuous? Because they think it's good. So that, it's a safe assumption is what I'm getting at. Maybe we could say if we know anything about virtue, we know that it's good. So they go with that. Okay, and like I said, that's the first assumption that they work with. Virtue is a good thing, right? And then that leads Socrates to point out that, if nothing is good except knowledge, and we're assuming virtue is good, then virtue itself must fall under the rubric of knowledge. It must be a kind of knowledge or a part of knowledge, right? That's, again, on the assumption that virtue is something good, which is a pretty safe assumption. And then this possible candidate claim, we don't know if it's true yet, that nothing is really good other than knowledge. If we could prove that, then we would know that virtue is a part of knowledge or something along those lines. Okay, so Socrates goes for it. He tries to consider what's good. Basically, he makes a broad distinction between external goods and internal goods. And with external goods, you get things like health and wealth and beauty. And let me see if I could find another one here. Strength. Okay, yeah, that's a good one. So those are listed in the text, and you could add more, I'm sure. So are those goods? Those aren't knowledge. The question is, are they good? Well, they're neither good nor bad, as one of my mentors, Naomi Rishotko, likes to say. They belong to the neither good nor bad category, meaning wealth could be good. What are you going to do with it, though? Are you going to build killer robots with your wealth? Or, are you going to feed people and clothe them and house them? Or are you going to build nice robots that do helpful things and, create a company that sells the robots fairly cheaply and then maybe even give away the profits? And okay, that's a good use of your wealth. Right. So Socrates thinks you'll do something good with your wealth if it's connected to wisdom / knowledge. We're kind of equivocating on that here. That's okay. We don't need a distinction between those two right now. So Socrates thinks if you know what's good and how to pursue the good, then that's what you'll do with your wealth. And we've seen this sort of thing from him before. Well, why would I corrupt the youth? Remember in the Apology, that's just going to harm me. He for him, maybe this is how it works for him internally. If he knows what's good, that's what he'll pursue. So he, we could argue about it, but we won't right now. So he certainly at least assumes, he could give some arguments, but we're not going to get into them, that, if you could see what's good, that'll motivate you to do it. So wealth is neither good nor bad in itself. If you could see a good thing to do with your wealth, then that's what you'll do. You won't deliberately do bad things with your wealth, right? That at least is his view. Health, maybe this didn't strike you at first, but you've got to be well enough to do either good or evil. Maybe you have to be, you should be somewhat healthy, I guess, to physically assault someone. That requires a certain amount of health and strength. But of course, you could also use health and strength to be a firefighter and put out fires and save people from fires. What will determine which way you go? Well, Socrates thinks we already know that it's wisdom, knowledge, right? So health and strength are neither good nor bad. But guided by knowledge, they're good, right? And then he doesn't go through a bunch of internal goods. He does mention one specific virtue, which is courage. And the thing about courage is if you subtract wisdom from it, it's just a certain kind of boldness, possibly even recklessness, right? What is courage without the guidance of wisdom? Well, it's just running toward danger, without getting worried about it. Now, with wisdom, It's running into danger when that could actually be useful, but retreating when it definitely couldn't be useful, right? You don't want to waste your courage. If you waste your courage, you'll probably die, and then you won't be able to exercise your courage tomorrow, right? So even an internal good like courage is sort of neither good nor bad. It seems it needs wisdom guiding it, and then it can be good. So it would seem that nothing is really good except knowledge, right? So then virtue must be a part of knowledge, right? Virtue is a part of knowledge, which confirms something we already believed, that we already suspected. People aren't good by nature. If virtue is a kind of knowledge, then they have to acquire it through recollection, maybe, or some other way. Regular teaching, we don't know exactly. We didn't get that far in the Meno. But in any case, if it's an acquisition, it's not something we have by nature. And then, that's kind of what we think we see around us. We're surprised at the depravity sometimes. And if we knew which young people were good, maybe we would lock them up in the citadel, as Socrates suggests, and sort of save them, make sure they get to adulthood so they can rule the city with virtue, something like that. Okay, so now Socrates says, look, if something can be taught, then there are teachers and learners of it, right? Right? Yeah, right. I can't help but think of Newtonian mechanics, which didn't exist when Plato wrote this. Right. Is it a counterexample or not? Well, they're saying if something can be taught, there must be teachers and learners of it. Well, I guess you could say Newtonian mechanics couldn't be taught yet. Somebody had to discover it. Right. So and then it turns out virtue is in the same spot. Socrates wants to hold it open that eventually virtue could be taught. Eventually there could be teachers and learners of it. But are there teachers and learners of it right now? Well, no. Socrates and Meno end up agreeing that no, there are not teachers and learners right now. How do they come to that conclusion? Well, first of all, the Sophists come up, right? Because they want to know, well, are there teachers of virtue? Well, the Sophists claim to teach virtue, right? So do they really? And then, and that's when Anytus happens to show up, one way or the other. And so they bring Anytus into the conversation. And of course, Anytus is very anti-sophist. My goodness, why would you go anywhere near those people? They corrupt everybody, right? Anytus is coming across as a very conventional person, possibly a little paranoid, right? So we're setting a scene. This helps us understand his role in the Apology, or that's what Plato is going for. So this is just the kind of guy Anytus is. So he tries to scare them off of the Sophists as people who could teach virtue. So anyway, Socrates has talked up the Sophists a bit, but he eventually says, well, we can't agree. Anytus is very adamant. We can't agree that the Sophists teach virtue, right? So in order for us to know that virtue could be taught. There should be there should be teachers and learners, and then we can't agree that there are teachers and learners, so then we don't know that virtue can be taught. That's a fair line of assessment. I mean, Anytus isn't really coming across as terribly credible here. He seems biased, but yeah, it is true. The Greeks in general could not agree that the Sophists were able to teach virtue. The Sophists always had a mixed reputation. And then things get a little more personal. Socrates names some names. That is to say, I certainly don't want to get into the specific names. It doesn't mean much to us. But basically, he brings up prominent Athenians and their sons. You know, and it bothers Anytus quite a bit. Socrates brings up people known for their virtue, and he points out that their sons weren't so virtuous, right? Now, the fathers taught their sons lots of things. They hired people to make them good horse riders. They hired people to teach them how to throw the javelin. They hired people to teach them to play the flute, and so on. They taught their sons all sorts of skills. They were willing to throw a lot of money at it. So they would have wanted to teach them virtue. I mean, these were virtuous men, going by reputation. Socrates is picking people known for their virtue. And he's saying, but their sons weren't that virtuous. They would, as virtuous men, they would have wanted to pass it on. They would have wanted that legacy to continue. It didn't continue. Okay, so then that gives us reason to think, oh, we got some virtuous people here and they weren't able to teach their virtue, so maybe there are no teachers of virtue. And then the final nail in the coffin is Socrates says to Meno, aren't there worthy men in Thessaly? Aren't there noble, good men? Yeah, of course, Meno says. Do they agree they can teach virtue? Well, no, heavens no, Meno says. And, that's why I'm asking you this question, because the virtuous men in Thessaly don't agree that virtue can be taught. So the issue remains controversial. Okay, so we can't agree that the Sophists teach virtue. Prominent Athenian men failed to pass on their virtue to their sons, even though they taught them lots of other things that cost a lot of money. The worthy men of Thessaly don't agree that virtue can be taught. Okay, well, it seems like there are no teachers and learners of virtue. Right now we said if virtue can be taught or anything can be taught, there are teachers and learners. So again, the contrapositive matters. There are no teachers and learners of virtue, so it can't be taught. And then bring in that other contrapositive. Oh, it can't be taught, therefore there's no knowledge of it. So on the one hand, we've argued that virtue is some kind of knowledge because it's good and nothing is good except knowledge. But then on the other hand, we've argued that if it can be taught, there are teachers and learners of it, but there are no teachers and learners of virtue, so virtue can't be taught, and if it can't be taught, then it's not any kind of knowledge. Where does that leave us? Well, now we need an epiphany to save us. Socrates has an epiphany. He says, I was being silly. Not quite how he puts it. But yeah, I was being silly. I said the only good thing is knowledge, but I thought of this other thing. What about correct opinion? Isn't correct opinion beneficial? Doesn't it do good things for us? And Meno thinks that sounds promising. So imagine somebody wants to go to Larissa and can't find anyone with knowledge of Larissa. Now if you want to have knowledge of Larissa and the way to Larissa, then you need to have actually traveled to Larissa. But what if you found someone who heard a report and could report to you accurately how to get to Larissa? So that would be correct opinion. That's not knowledge because this person has no first-hand experience. But wouldn't that correct opinion get you there? Yes, right? So do we still want knowledge? Yes. So, Meno suggests that maybe correct opinion isn't reliable. Socrates wants to refine that. He says, wait a minute, it's reliable when you have it. Let's be clear on that. So long as the correct opinion doesn't go away or give out, it's very beneficial, it's a good guide, but it does tend to go away. Mere correct opinion, as opposed to knowledge, tends to go away. Socrates compares correct opinion to one of Daedalus's statues. You might recall, we talked about those before. They're so lifelike they move, right? So correct opinions might run away from you. And then what will you do? You'll lose the benefit. You'll lose the guidance. So knowledge is better. Why is it better? Why does it stay? Well, knowledge is systematic. That's not a word used in the text, but that's the idea that Socrates seems to be going for. Knowledge is systematic. Claims follow from other claims. You get general principles. You get statements that you deduce from the general principles. You get broader categories and narrower categories. That knowledge is hierarchical. There's a system. So different parts of the system reinforce each other, like a building, right? So correct opinion is just random things here and there. It would seem, but if you could systematize it, then you get knowledge. So correct opinion is great. Maybe that's all we have in some cases. Knowledge is better. Where does that leave us? Well, virtue is good. We don't want to give that up. But it's not knowledge. That's where arguments have led us. So it's correct opinion, which is interesting. And that also harks back to the Apology. There's been a lot of harking back to the Apology. So remember, Socrates interrogated the politicians and they didn't know anything, but some of them led the city well. And then of the poets, Socrates specifically said, well, they can write wonderful poetry, but they can't tell you how they did it. So now we're back to that sort of thing, divine inspiration. So we've had really good virtuous men who've led Athens, right? How did they do it? Well, some kind of divine inspiration, like they had correct opinion given to them by the gods, apparently, but they didn't have knowledge. If they'd had knowledge, they would have passed it on. They didn't have it. Okay, and that's where the dialogue finally ends. It's actually Socrates who's busy this time. You might remember in the Euthyphro said, I gotta go, Socrates. In this case, it's Socrates who has to go. But we seem to have gotten somewhere. This isn't total Aporia, right? There is something to virtue. It's a kind of correct opinion. We have some characterization of it that we can walk away with that hasn't been refuted, and we might get to know it better because we've got recollection now. So maybe really scrutinizing these examples of virtuous men could do something for us. Plato doesn't say that, but that seems to follow. I mean, how would you recollect? You've got to get some kind of trigger to recollect. So maybe studying the virtuous people By the way, Aristotle says something like that, so maybe that's what Aristotle got out of reading the Meno. Okay, well, it's been a grand adventure. I hope we enjoyed it. I'm sure you're glad to not be left in a state of aporia. Again, be well, everybody.